In this video, we are going to begin our discussion on economics. So what we're going to do is we're just going to, in this video, really look at some overarching ideas and concepts that I want us to keep in mind as we continue our study. We're going to start by talking about what is economics. Now, a lot of people are going to think of economics in terms of money and kind of concepts that have to do with money, right? Banking, investment, labor, those kinds of things. Right now, all of those things definitely are in the scope of the field of economics, but they don't really get at what economics is at its core. My favorite definition of economics is that economics is the study of human action. Through studying economics, we can get a better understanding of why people behave the way they do, right? And we're going to look at what I call 5 main tenets of economics. These are slightly different from the ones in your book if you are following along there. They have 10 big ideas. I condensed some of them, kind of collapsed some of them into a single thing, and others may have left out because I didn't feel that they were as pertinent to this class. All right, but let's go ahead and look through those 5 tenets of economics. And we'll just go through those one by one. The first tenet of economics is that people are rational. All right, what this really boils down to is that people are going to make decisions that are good for themselves, right? When we get into trade and we're talking about making trades, this comes in very importantly because it's important to remember that when trading, nobody's going to make a trade that's going to make them worse off, all right? People are not likely, right, or just they're not going to take actions that make them worse off, right? Now, whether they feel like they were made worse off in the future kind of doesn't really play into it, but in the moment of the decision, right, people are not going to be making decisions that are going to hurt them. We're going to talk a little bit about that in just a second, but let's explore this topic a little bit more. Now, the reason I want to spend a little time on this is because this statement, when you first see it, might not seem very valid, right? People are rational. Well, I've seen so many people do so many irrational things that this statement simply cannot be true. And that's a fair criticism, I would say. People do things all the time that I think are somewhat irrational in the kind of colloquial sense. For example, a very recent example of this is the kind of run on toilet paper caused by the coronavirus pandemic. I'm still not really sure why you needed that much toilet paper, or that people needed that much toilet paper when they first heard about this, but here we are, kind of shelves barren, even to this point still a bit, but you know, why I still don't understand that one. But we're going to talk a little bit about why what we see as irrational behavior isn't necessarily irrational behavior. All right, a big thing that comes into this is the concept that incentives matter. Right, the incentives that people face in decision making, right, the things that the pros and cons of taking a specific action matter a lot. And one person's incentive structure, right, the incentives that one person faces for a particular action and the incentives someone else faces for that same action are not necessarily the same. Right, one of my favorite examples of this is when well, what are they called? Humanitarian groups, that's what it was. So humanitarian groups were trying to reduce the incidence of malaria in kind of places in Africa, and I believe also in Asia. Right? Malaria is a disease that's pretty deadly if you don't have access to the proper medical treatment. It's also spread by mosquitoes. So one of the ways that humanitarians tried to prevent the spread of malaria is by either providing free of charge or for a very low cost treated nets that would protect people while they slept and also kill any mosquitoes that came into contact with them. Right? So these nets were kind of distributed widely both in Africa and I believe also in Asia, but don't quote me on that. However, many of the people that received these nets did not use them for their intended purposes. Right? They did not hang them above their beds to prevent mosquitoes from biting them in their sleep. Instead, what they did was use them for fishing. Right? So we might just hear that kind of first part that these individuals were not using these nets to prevent malaria, and we might think that that is not rational. We might think that that's irrational behavior. Right? But when we go a step further and we look at the actual incentives that these people are facing, right, it makes a lot more sense that they wouldn't use these nets to prevent malaria. Right? If you or your kids are hungry or starving, right, preventing malaria is going to take a back seat. Right? Instead, it makes more sense for you to go out and use this net to fish. Right? Now, this is rational behavior. It's also a great example of unintended consequences because the humanitarian group did not consider the incentives of the people they were distributing these nets to, right? And they didn't consider the effects of kind of following actions, right? As such, right, a lot of individuals are using these nets to fish. Right? These nets were not designed for fishing. Right? One, they've got really small holes, much smaller than in a traditional fishing net. All right? And so not only were fishermen catching the big fish that were kind of an appropriate size for eating and for catching, they were also catching all of these small fish that really needed to stay in those bodies of water. Right? And so these nets were very detrimental to fish populations, because not only were you catching fish that were of the size and maturity that you would want, you were also catching all of the immature fish that would be needed to replenish those stocks. All right. Also, the fact that the nets were treated and they were being dragged through the water was also not great, because that led to some contamination. All right, but incentives matter. We have to look at the incentives that people are facing in order to understand the decisions that they make. All right, another thing to consider is the fact that people face non-pecuniary incentives. All right, so non-pecuniary, saying it doesn't have to do with money. So it's not a monetary incentive, right? It's something else. Right? A couple of examples of these non-pecuniary incentives. One is what we call warm glow giving. All right? This is the idea that when you really boil it down to just the pecuniary aspect, just the monetary aspect, and you look at something like giving to charity, this might not seem rational, right? You are giving money that you have to someone else in exchange for nothing, right? So why do people give money to charity, right? The reason for this is warm glow giving, right? When you give to charity, you get a good feeling, right? You feel good about yourself. You've done something to help somebody else, right? And so you are, in essence, buying units of this warm glow whenever you donate to charity, right? It's part of a reason why there's an argument that altruism doesn't exist, that people can't do something just in a selfless way, because there's always going to be some reward for it, right? Whether that's the warm glow or something else. Now, that's a bit of a cynical view, but that is kind of the economic take on it. All right. Another example of non-pecuniary incentives would be what we call reputation mechanics, right? Reputation mechanics. So if you are a small business owner, right, you might have an incentive in the short run to just rip people off. Like maybe, just for example, let's say you're a mechanic, right? You might have an incentive to rip people off, but you could make some more money in the short run, but there's also a reputation mechanic. If you start ripping everybody off, word's going to get around, nobody is going to come and get you to fix their vehicle, right? And so you kind of forego some additional profits in order to maintain that reputation. All right, another thing to consider is what we call bounded rationality. All right, people don't have full information. All right, so people are going to make decisions in the moment with the best information they have, right? And they are going to make the most rational decision they can. Now, later on, they might feel that was not a good decision, but you can't really say, oh, well, I know this now, I should have known it then. Well, you didn't, so that decision you made was still rational. I liken this most often to something like buyer's remorse. In the moment when you buy something, you obviously you think it's worth the money, or you would not choose to buy it. But after the fact, you might find out that it doesn't do what you wanted it to. Maybe it doesn't do what you wanted it to do very well, or maybe it's just not a good product. Maybe it's poorly made, what have you, and you might feel like you made a poor decision. But again, that's that hindsight is 20/20, right? Bounded rationality. You can't have full information all of the time. All right. And the last kind of concept here is the fact that value is subjective. All right. So every person, all right, just like with incentives, every person's valuation of an action or a good or a service is going to be different, right? Even for the same individual, their valuation of something might change based on various factors like location, situation, right? A multitude of things, but let's keep it simple, all right? Value is subjective. What you consider valuable, not someone else might not consider valuable at all. Right. An example I like to use for this is, well, first, let me just state this, right? So there is a comic book called Action Comics #1. And if you don't know anything about comic books, it might just sound like, okay, this is a comic book, right? But someone paid $3.2 million for an issue of Action Comics #1 in 2014, right? So what would warrant someone paying such an exorbitant amount of money for a bunch of paper folded together with some pictures in it, right? Well, I'm assuming this person was a fan of comic books, all right? Also, this is the first appearance of Superman, right? So if you are very into comic books, especially if you're very interested in Superman, right, and you have $3.2 million laying around, right, it might make sense to buy this comic book, right? I'm a big comic book fan and I like Superman a lot, but I would never buy a issue of Action Comics #1 for $3.2 million. Mostly because I don't have $3.2 million, but if I did, even then I don't think I would buy it because it's not that valuable to me. All right, but that's not the case for whoever purchased this in 2014. All right, so we need to consider, right, the incentives people face. We need to recognize that value is subjective, and that can help us kind of figure out why people do what they do, right? And go from what might seem like an irrational decision. And then once we understand those ideas, those concepts of what incentives people are facing, right? the concept of bounded rationality, so on and so forth, we can understand why people make the decisions that they do and why those decisions are, in fact, rational. The second main tenet of economics is that people face trade-offs. All right, so people face trade-offs every day. All right, they make decisions about, well, a multitude of things. Right, where should I use these resources? Right, where's going to be the best place? Right, so how should I spend my money, for example, right? What's going to be the most valuable thing? I've only got a finite amount of money, right? I can spend it on certain goods, but probably there are going to be more goods that you want than you have money for, right? And so you have to make decisions, right? The reason for this and kind of the idea that I was just describing is scarcity. All right, scarcity is why we face trade-offs. All right, scarcity and the idea of facing trade-offs can be described with the phrase, we have unlimited wants and limited resources, all right? So how do we balance those unlimited wants with our limited resources, all right? There's only so much of any given resource, whether we're talking about money, whether we're talking about something more tangible. Well, I guess money's pretty tangible, but something even more tangible like raw materials like oil or iron or steel, or we're talking about something a little bit less tangible like time, right? Time is scarce. We all only have a finite amount of time on this earth, right? And so we have to be careful about how we choose to spend it, right? So we have to make decisions, right? Am I going to take the time to watch this entire video that my economics instructor has uploaded, or am I going to kind of just skim it and see if I can get the gist, right? Or maybe because there's a party I want to get to, right? I don't recommend that. I know I ramble, but I feel like it would be hard to skim through a video. I don't really, yeah, anyways. So people, all right, there is scarcity in this world, all right, and so that's why people face trade-offs. Right. I'd also like to go ahead and introduce the concept of opportunity costs. All right, so opportunity costs, we're going to talk more about this in the next chapter, but opportunity costs on a very simple level, these are the cost, it's kind of the value of the best option foregone. All right, so what is the thing that you could be doing instead of what you're doing right now, all right, what's the value of that? All right, the best option. So if you, instead of watching this video, what would you be doing instead, right? That is your opportunity cost. Right, so for this course, right, if you are taking time to watch this video, what are your opportunity costs? Well, it kind of depends on what your next best option is, right? If your next best option was to sleep for however long this video is instead of watching it, right, that's your opportunity cost. If instead of watching this video you would be at work, then the value of kind of your labor at work is your opportunity cost, right? So on and so forth. All right, so opportunity costs are essentially the best option we forego when, right, making those trade-offs. Again, we're going to get more into that in the next chapter. All right, our third tenet of economics is that people think at the margin. right, so this is really a concept that is more important for a microeconomics class rather than a macroeconomics class, but it is still a very important part of economics. Right, so what this is telling us, right, this idea that people think at the margin, is telling us that people kind of make their decisions incrementally, right? They kind of weigh the costs and benefits of each additional unit of a good they're purchasing, right? The marginal cost and marginal benefit, right? The benefit of one more versus the cost of one more, right? For actions, for goods, right, what have you, right, and make their decisions based on those calculations, right? Now, it's not a calculation that we do like consciously, like X times 50 or whatever, I don't know, but we do think at the margin, all right? Just a silly example of this, but one that I quite like, is that let's say that I go out to, I don't know, a shop, and I buy a box of donuts, right? I'm probably going to eat those donuts one at a time, right? I eat the first one, that was a delicious donut, I'm still hungry, I'll eat another one, and maybe I keep eating them until I start feeling a little sick, right? I'm sweating, my mouth's coated in sugar, right? And I just want to go take a nap, right? I'm going to keep eating those donuts until the cost of eating the next donut outweighs the benefit of eating the next donut, right? I'm not going to just automatically grab all of them and shove them into my mouth, right? I'm going to look at kind of how is this going to affect me, right? One more unit, right? One additional unit, right? Thinking at the margin, right? So thinking at the edge. All right, that's really all I have to say about that one. So let's go ahead and move on. All right, fourth. All right, the fourth tenet of economics is that trade makes people better off. All right, we're also going to talk about this one more in depth in the next video, but this is very important. Thinking about our incentives, thinking about that idea of people being rational, right? A person's not going to make a trade that's not going to be beneficial to themselves. So if you are engaging in a trade, right, it's making you better off, right? That's kind of the very basic idea behind this. All right, but let's talk a little bit about how trade can make people better off. All right, one of the main ways, probably the biggest way that trade makes us better off is through specialization. All right, if you are able to trade the product of your labor with other people, right, then you can specialize in producing one type of good or service, right? You can become better at it, you can become more efficient at it, so that you, right, can produce more of this good than you need. You can trade the excess to other people to get a larger variety of goods. Right? We often contrast specialization and the idea of specialization with the idea of Robinson Crusoe, right? Being trapped on a deserted island, right? If you are all by yourself, trapped on a deserted island, you have to do everything for yourself. You have to find your own food, your own shelter. You have to literally do everything for yourself. Right? So most of your day was going to be taken up by just satisfying your basic needs, right? Water, food, shelter, so on and so forth, right? And you're going to be spending so much time doing a little bit of all these different tasks that you're not going to really get great at any of them, right? Whereas when we have specialization, if one person can spend all their time, say, fishing, right? And one person spends all their time making shelter, right? Again, just sticking with the deserted island motif, right? Then they can each get better at those jobs and produce more of both goods than if these two individuals were just looking after themselves, right? And so specialization allows for more goods. It also allows, in the advanced states like we're in now, right, allows people to be economics instructors, right? This job would not exist if we did not have trade, right? My job would not exist if we did not have trade, right? They can also, scientists doing research, right? Inventors, right? People that are creating new products, new goods, new services, right? Those individuals would not have the ability to dedicate that time to inventing new things without specialization, right? So with specialization, we get a greater number of the goods that we already have, plus we also get the creation of new goods. All right, so specialization is I would argue almost, is good. I don't see how you could argue against that, right? It's one of the ways trade makes people better off. All right, another way that trade makes people better off is something we've already kind of touched on. Value is subjective, the subjectivity of value. All right, because people value things at different levels, right, then even if no new goods are being produced, right, and I mean that in terms of no new products, like no new types of products, but also no, what we have, kind of no new goods, no additional units of the good. So if we just have what we have, right, we can still see benefits from trade because value is subjective. All right, so a quick illustration of this point. All right, so Rick has an apple that he values at $1. And Morty has an orange that he values at $2. Right, so right now, the total welfare, if we're measuring, how much happiness there is in this two-person economy in dollars, right, the total is a kind of total welfare of $3, the total happiness in dollars of $3. All right, but let's say that Rick values an orange at $3. And Morty values apples at $3. All right, so now, right, what if they trade, right? Rick only values his apple at $1, right? But he values the orange at $3, so he would definitely be willing to trade an apple for an orange. Morty has an orange that he values at $2, but he values apples at $3, so he would also be willing to trade because he would increase his welfare by $1. Right, so if Rick and Morty trade, all right, so after the trade, Rick is going to obtain an orange that he values at $3. Morty is going to obtain an apple that he values at $3. So the total welfare, right, is $6. No new goods have been produced. We only have one orange and one apple when we start and when we finish. But because Morty and Rick value these goods at different levels, right? Because the value is subjective, right, we can increase the total welfare, right, without producing any new goods. All right. So some people will look at this and say, well, Morty is getting a bad deal because Rick gets to increase his total welfare by 2, and Morty only gets to increase his welfare by 1. Right? However, that's not really the point, right? Just because, if you're both being made better off, but one person is being made even better off, that's not necessarily going to prevent you from completing that trade. You're both better off at the end of the day, right? It's not like Morty is worse off than he was, right? If you have some kind of non-pecuniary incentive like spite, and you're just spiteful and you want an even trade, then maybe that comes into play. But if we're looking at it kind of in the basic, just money, just talking about kind of welfare on a dollar amount level, right? This is still making both of them better off, as trade makes people better off. All right, the final main tenet is the fact that institutions matter. We're going to talk about this in a little bit more detail later down the line during the semester, so I'm not going to go as deep into the rabbit hole as I usually do. But institutions in an economic sense, probably one of the best definitions, or like the simplest definitions I've ever seen, is that institutions are the rules of the game. Right, institutions define the incentive structure that people face. Right, they are the rules of the game, how you play the game to get to the ends that you want to get to. Right, there are 2 overarching categories of institutions that we talk about. Right, we have formal institutions. Formal institutions are the codified kind of rules that are backed by usually a state, a government of some kind. Right? If you go against these, there is a central authority, right, that is going to kind of enact a response if you go against them, right? Whatever that response may be. Those are the formal institutions. All right, we also have informal institutions, right? Informal institutions are things like taboos, customs, traditions. Religion would fall under informal institutions most of the time, right? These are things that they are not enforced by some central power, but they are enforced through societal measures, right? Through things like ostracism and other less intense methods of kind of social sanctions, right? If you're doing something, kind of the old idea of a young couple living together, they're living in sin, right? The little old ladies at the church might kind of be like, just tisk at them or what have you, right? And maybe more than that, right? Really just gossip about them, right? So those would be kind of those informal institutions, right? These are both very important, right? Again, we're going to talk about these more in depth later, but just as an example for both of these, Right, so formal institutions, right? One really important formal institution is property rights. As we're going to see later on, if we don't have property rights, there's very little incentive for people to store up any fruits of their labor, whether we're talking about holding reserves of cash or grain or anything, right? If somebody can just come take it, you're not likely to have just keep a bunch extra for other purposes, right? You're just going to get what you need and you're going to use it, because if you don't do that, you might lose what you've gathered, right? Very important. If you don't have property rights, that's one of the most basic things you need for economies to do well, right? Informal institutions, an example of this would be kind of the example that always goes to is kind of the example of dowries in India, and I believe maybe other parts of the world, but India is usually the big example, right? Dowries are a informal institution, or where the father of a woman has to pay money or give some kind of assets to the man that she is marrying, right? These are definitely informal institutions because they have been outlawed in India. However, they're so rooted in the culture that they still persist, I believe, especially in rural areas, right? Because of this institution, right, there has been a marked preference for boys over girls in kind of parenting, right? People just prefer to have boys because they see girls as a future expense that they're going to have to take care of, right? So this has led to boys getting better treatment just in general, right? Getting more access to nutrition, to medicine, to education, to all kinds of things that the girls are not getting access to, right? This has led to this along with probably the first one's sinister, but the second one's really sinister, is the uprising of a lot of sex-selective abortions has led there to be a huge discrepancy between the number of males and females in India, right? You'd expect it to be about 50-50, right? But it's actually, I don't remember the exact percentages, but it was actually definitely more towards the men. There are more men in India than women, right? And that's because of this very powerful informal institution. All right, the very last thing that I want us to discuss is two types of economics, or two types of economic statements. Right, so the first type is what we call positive economics. Right, positive economics is just when we're making statements about what is, right, how things are. All right, so these are statements that are just based on fact or economic theory. All right, so it could be things like increasing income taxes will lead to a decrease in aggregate demand, right? So a statement like that, well, it's kind of based in theory. I'm saying if you do this, then this will happen, all right? It does not necessarily have to be true for it to be a positive statement, but it has to be something that we can test, right? So that statement was kind of based on theory, right? We could look at historical data to see if that actually bears out, right? And we could prove or disprove that, right? It's just about facts, it's just about what is. Right, that's what positive statements are, right? Another one would be just kind of a descriptive thing. So the GDP for the US in 1912 was $3.7 million. I don't know if that's true or not, so don't write that down, but that's an example, right? It's just stating a fact. On the other side of the coin, we have normative economics. Right? So these are statements based on how things should be. Alright, so statements based on how things should be. We're going to try to avoid normative statements as much as possible, or really I should say I'm going to try to avoid them as much as possible. We're going to try to stick with positive statements in this class. Alright, the reason for that is because normative statements are based on value judgments. They're not based on facts, right? They're just based on an individual's kind of opinion or their valuation of how things should be. Right, we can't test that, right? That's not going to be a viable avenue to go down, right? There's probably going to be a point where I may make some normative statements, but if I do, I'll try to let you know that is my opinion and not actually an economic fact, right? So examples of normative economics, right? Something like the government should abolish the IRS in order to increase GDP. Right? That's a value statement. Should they abolish the IRS? You can't prove that one way or another. That's based on an individual's valuation. Right? We should place a 10-cent tax on gas in order to fund road repairs and kind of other infrastructure upgrades. Again, maybe that's a good idea, maybe not. We can't test that. We can't, say that's a true statement or a false statement. Right? That's going to be based on an individual's values. All right. So again, I'm going to try to stick with positive statements. Try to stay away from those normative statements. All right, that is it for this first introductory video. In the next video, we are going to start looking at trade and exchange. So we're going to look a little bit more at kind of these concepts of how trade makes people better off. We're going to look at specialization, talk about that a little bit more, talk about the subjectivity of value. All right, and then actually start getting some models and some graphs involved. All right, I will see you in the next video.